Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. What is the future of Dungeons and Dragons? That is a very pertinent question as the update to the 5th edition of rules has recently come out and talks of virtual tabletops, subscription services have fundamentally altered the way we think about what Dungeons and Dragons is. It is worth remembering where Dungeons and Dragons started. In the 1970s, a group of friends making rules for playing a game sat around the table with figurines. And as Dungeons and Dragons has evolved, this core idea has remained a vital part of the game. It is a game to be played sat around a table with paper and pencils and dice and models and a map. Recently, virtual tabletops have exploded in popularity, and right now I play almost all of my roleplay games virtually. As an adult in his 40s with a wife and children and a mortgage, I don't have the opportunity to play face-to-face as much as I would like. My friends who I regularly play with, who we all used to live within a few kilometres of each other, are now spread around the south and centre of Finland, so that actually getting together to meet up face to face is now a huge logistics challenge. If I can play any game face to face with 2 or more of my friends, this is now a challenge that can take weeks to organise. I'm not the only one with children, with a partner, and the core group that regularly plays together is 5 people. For all 5 of us to get together for several hours to play, that's a real challenge, and I think it's happened once or twice in the last few years. It is difficult. So virtual tabletops are fantastic. They allow us to play even though we can't physically be in the same room. And using built-in voice and video chat or Discord as a supplemental service allows us to have some form of contact. I think using video is quite important in this context for the human interaction, even though seeing the person you're playing with makes no difference to the actual game. It's an important element of humanization. I think virtual tabletops are here to stay. The question is, do roleplay games still write themselves to be a game played around a table and the virtual tabletop emulates that? Or are we moving to a situation where virtual tabletops are going to be seen as the default, the norm, and things incorporated into the virtual tabletops that might not actually work if you play face to face? There are plenty of rules in different games that are very easy when you're sat around the table using dice, but are not necessarily easily implementable in virtual tabletops unless you write quite a lot of code to deal with it. A good example is from the Star Wars Age of Empire games from Fantasy Flight Games. One of the class abilities for, I can't remember if it was the smuggler or the gambler, allows you to nudge a dice to change a result from one face to an adjacent face. That's a very characterful ability for that player archetype. And sat around the table, that's very easy. You look at the dice and go, you know what, I don't want this result, I want the one next to it. For something like Roll20, this would be almost impossible to implement because the way the dice roll works is it just gives you a random result from a list of results for that dice. I'm sure you could write code that would allow you to do this, but that's not something that most players can easily do. So unless the game specifically has that mechanic coded into it, you can't use that in a virtual tabletop. On the other hand, if a game was written for a virtual tabletop, there is an amount of maths that the computer can do that would stop gameplay and require everyone to get a calculator out. And I think we can agree that we don't want to do that when we are playing face to face. if a game was written to be primarily played virtually, all this maths, all this bookkeeping becomes incredibly easy. Keeping track of statuses and other effects on characters is now a click of a button, or even automatic. If I am playing a game with a character that has a poisoned weapon, if all I have to do is click on my target and it will say, yep, this target takes this much damage and is poisoned, there is no bookkeeping, there's nothing slowing play down, and that system can be made as complicated as you like, even if it then wouldn't be implementable in a tabletop way. Do we want this? Do we want our virtual tabletops to accurately represent the game as it would be played if we are around a table? Or do we want to decouple these two games? Do we want to have a virtual tabletop game that couldn't easily be played face to face? The other option is perhaps even more removed. With the huge success of Baldur's Gate 3, what is the future of Dungeons and Dragons going to be? Is it going to be a full video game instead of a virtual tabletop where you are moving tokens around a map? Are you now sat in front of a screen with a controller telling your character where to walk, clicking on objects you want to interact or attack? I have not experienced the prototype VTT that Wizards of the Coast is working on. I've heard other creators talking about it and saying they were very impressed by it. But is it still Dungeons and Dragons? Even if it follows Dungeons and Dragons rule mechanics, if it plays more like Elder Scrolls, is it still the game that we want? The other issue is with video game versions of Dungeons and Dragons is how do we handle social interaction? In Baldur's Gate 3, there is a huge amount of text and storytelling options when you interact with non-player characters. Your player character's species and class and the events they've already done in the game will affect the dialogue options you have when you play the game. But one of the great things of role-playing games is that you are playing with a human dungeon master who can make up appropriate responses as we go along. If I'm playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons and I want to know, what's the name of the blacksmith in town? My dungeon master can make up a response and it's fine. With a role-play game on a computer, every single piece of information needs to be pre-written, unless we take the route of AI. Is the future of Dungeons and Dragons a virtual games master powered by AI who you can talk to using your voice, who will convert your speech to text, run it through some kind of large language learning module, LLM, and generate an appropriate response? If I'm playing a game with an AI dungeon master and I walk into a shop and I say, hey, do you have any health potions for sale? The game doesn't necessarily have to have that information encoded. It can look through, this is a magic shop, what's the chances of that happening, and say yes or no, and generate an appropriate inventory on that. If I am interacting with a goblin shaman, if I try to ask it nicely, will it be more favorable? If I try to threaten it, will it respond appropriately to threats? This all depends on how the AI has been programmed. And maybe the future of roleplay games is designers creating a set of flags for AI characters saying, this character responds to flattery, but not flirtation. This character responds to threats, but not bribery. This character likes red, so if you give them red flowers, they will be more favorable towards you than if you give them blue flowers. And how can these visual clues, how can these characteristic clues be represented visually? Would I play a game like that? I'm not sure that I would. Technically, it would be a marvel. But for me, Dungeons and Dragons is a social game. I want to interact with other humans. I want to experience their ingenuity, their creativity, their emotional responses. I don't want to end up in a situation where I'm flirting with an AI barmaid because I can't afford the bottle of wine that I need to bribe the elf down the road. That doesn't seem like the kind of game that I want to play. If I want to play an Elder Scrolls game, I'll play an Elder Scrolls game. If I want to play Baldur's Gate 3, I will play Baldur's Gate 3. If I want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I want to sit around the table with a group of people and play a game. And if I can't do that, I want a virtual tabletop that represents that experience as accurately as possible. One discussion on virtual tabletops is the opportunity for monetization. I just put out a video on monetization, and this is something that scares me. The idea of having microtransactions in your virtual tabletop so you can buy additional character skins or alternative character animations. Right now, using Roll20, I have a token that represents my character. And when my character uses Eldritch Blast, I will tell people in the game how I represent that. So recently, I had it so that Eldritch Blast manifests as two spectral hippopotamuses, and charges towards the enemy, trampling them as it deals damage. Now, that still does D10 plus charisma modifier force damage, but that story element is mine. And every time I use Eldritch Blast, I try to think of a different way of visualizing it, and that's my way of customizing my character. If the virtual tabletop had a little animation of my character casting the spell, and I could pay money to get a different animation or a different aesthetic for the Eldritch Blast, that's not improving the game for me. That's taking my money for something that doesn't matter. The storytelling is me, not the game. So paying for more visual effects or more animations, it's a money grab that I'm not interested in. So, what do you think the future of Dungeons and Dragons is going to be? Should it still be at its heart a game played around the table, or the closest approximation to that we can make? Or should the future be a video game powered by AI? Surely that would be a technical marvel, but is that a game that you want to play? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And whatever your next game is, I hope it's a great one.